Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest stories that hide behind everyday lives. In today's video, we dive deep into the tragic tale of obsession, betrayal, and an irreversible outcome. At first glance, Heather's life seemed perfect. She was a devoted mother to her teenage daughter, Lily, and a respected member of her community. Heather prided herself on being the type of mother who was always there, guiding Lily through the ups and downs of adolescence. Their bond was strong, built on years of love and trust. They shared everything, from secrets to dreams, and Heather believed she was doing everything right. She had a loving husband, a decent home, and her life seemed to be on track. Yet, behind the scenes, Heather was quietly struggling with a deep sense of loneliness and dissatisfaction. When Lily introduced Chris, her new boyfriend, Heather thought little of it. He was charming, polite, and a perfect gentleman. He seemed to have a natural connection with Lily, and Heather could see how much he cared for her. Chris fit perfectly into their little family dynamic, and for a while, everything seemed to go smoothly. Heather even found herself admiring the way he treated Lily, how attentive he was, always asking about her day, being patient when she was upset. Chris made Lily laugh, something Heather hadn't seen in a while. However, over time, Heather began to notice something that made her uncomfortable. Chris wasn't just attentive to Lily, he was thoughtful and considerate toward Heather as well. He'd compliment her cooking, offer to help with chores, and even ask how she was feeling. At first, she appreciated his kindness, believing he was just being respectful, but the attention started to feel different. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart race a little faster each time he entered the room. Heather knew it was wrong to have these feelings for her daughter's boyfriend, but she couldn't help herself. It was as if Chris had filled a void in her life that she didn't even know existed. She began to look forward to the moments when he would visit, and as time went on, those moments seemed to get longer. She couldn't shake the thoughts that started creeping into her mind, thoughts that were darker than she wanted to admit. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she was becoming obsessed. Her affection for Chris was no longer just admiration for a young man who treated her daughter well. It had transformed into something much more dangerous, a longing that Heather couldn't control. She tried to ignore it, burying her feelings beneath a mask of normalcy. But the feelings only grew stronger, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. Heather couldn't turn away from what was happening inside her. It was the beginning of something she couldn't predict, something that would soon spiral out of control. As Heather's obsession with Chris deepened, she began to take more notice of the little things that she hadn't seen before. She studied his every move when he was around, from the way he laughed to the way he held Lily's hand. It was as though Heather had become fixated on him, watching his interactions with her daughter with growing jealousy and desire. She found herself comparing how Chris treated Lily to how her own husband had treated her in the past. The comparison left Heather feeling unimportant and invisible, while Chris seemed to offer her the kind of attention and validation she had been yearning for. Lily, unaware of her mother's growing obsession, continued to trust Chris completely, and their relationship blossomed. But Heather, unable to contain her feelings, began to subtly interfere. She started making passive comments about Chris, questioning his intentions, casting doubt on his sincerity. Whenever Lily would talk about him, Heather would feign concern, suggesting that maybe Chris wasn't as perfect as he seemed. She would point out things that she believed might be red flags, little flaws in his personality that she had convinced herself were warning signs of something more dangerous. At the same time, Heather made sure to spend more time alone with Chris, always finding excuses for his visits to their house. She would invite him over for dinner, and when Lily was occupied with schoolwork or out with friends, Heather would use the opportunity to engage in long, drawn-out conversations with him. She pretended to be concerned about his future, asking about his plans and dreams, while secretly enjoying the way he seemed to lean in closer to her, as though he found comfort in her presence. Heather would cook meals for him, serve him with a smile, and then linger just a little too long when their eyes met. She told herself it was harmless, just a motherly bond, but the truth was that her actions were calculated. Every interaction with Chris felt like an opportunity to draw him in, to make him see her as more than just Lily's mother. She had become addicted to the attention, to the way Chris made her feel seen and appreciated in a way her husband no longer did. As days turned into weeks, Heather grew more desperate. She began to notice Chris pulling away from her slightly, especially when he was with Lily. He seemed to sense the shift in her behavior, and although he tried to be polite, there was a noticeable distance between them. Heather couldn't understand why this was happening. She had been nothing but kind to him, and yet he seemed to grow more distant. Her mind raced with paranoia, and she began to convince herself that Lily was somehow driving a wedge between them. It was then that Heather realized the lengths she was willing to go to in order to keep Chris close. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, and she would stop at nothing to keep him in her life. Heather's obsession with Chris had grown to a level that could no longer be ignored. She knew she was spiraling, but the grip of her emotions was too strong for her to pull back. She found herself consumed by thoughts of him, where he was, what he was doing, and whether he was thinking of her the way she thought of him. Every moment that he wasn't around felt unbearable. She began planning ways to create situations where she and Chris would be alone together, desperate to feed the growing need inside her. One evening, when Lily was planning to go out with friends, Heather decided it was time to put her plan into motion. She told Lily she could have the night to herself, suggesting that Chris come over so they could have a grown-up conversation. She told herself it was innocent, a simple chat to clear the air after everything that had happened between them. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. She needed to be close to him again, to hold on to the fleeting moments that made her feel alive. When Chris arrived, Heather greeted him with a warm smile and invited him into the living room. She tried to keep her voice calm, but the nervous energy inside her was palpable. She offered him a drink, and they sat together, the silence stretching between them before she finally spoke. She made small talk at first, but soon enough, her words became more personal. She asked about his plans for the future, subtly steering the conversation toward his relationship with Lily. She seemed concerned, as though she was merely a mother looking out for her daughter's well-being, but there was an edge to her voice and urgency that couldn't be ignored. Chris, sensing the shift in her demeanor, began to feel uncomfortable. He tried to keep the conversation light, but Heather's intensity was unsettling. She began to ask him questions that were more intimate, probing into his feelings and emotions, as if trying to uncover the deeper layers of who he was. When he tried to redirect the conversation, Heather pushed back, her tone becoming more insistent. She could feel herself losing control, but she didn't care. She was so close to him now, and she wasn't going to let go. At one point, when Chris hesitated to answer one of her questions, Heather's frustration grew. She moved closer to him, her body language revealing the tension she was trying to suppress. She needed him to understand how much she cared, how much she wanted him. But Chris, feeling the pressure building, began to retreat inwardly. He could sense that something wasn't right, but he didn't know how to break free from the situation without causing conflict. The evening ended awkwardly, with Chris making his exit earlier than planned, his discomfort palpable. Heather watched him leave, feeling a mixture of disappointment and determination. She knew she had crossed a line, but she couldn't bring herself to feel regret. She was getting closer to him, and she believed that soon he would realize that she was the one who truly understood him. She had crossed a dangerous threshold, and now there was no turning back. Heather's mental state continued to unravel as the days passed. The lines between obsession and reality blurred, and she found herself unable to break free from the pull Chris had on her. Her thoughts were consumed by him, and everything in her life seemed to revolve around the idea of keeping him close. She began to convince herself that there was no other way to regain control. Chris had to be hers. She couldn't stand the thought of him being with Lily any longer. In Heather's mind, it was clear if she couldn't have him, no one else would. One afternoon, when Lily had gone to work, Heather saw an opportunity. She knew that Chris would be stopping by to pick something up that Lily had left behind. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She invited him over under the pretense of wanting to apologize for the awkwardness of their last encounter, but deep down, she had a much darker plan in mind. Heather told herself that this was the only way to fix everything, to make Chris see how much she truly cared for him. When Chris arrived, he was polite but visibly wary, his body language tight and uncomfortable. He had been distant for days, unsure of how to act around Heather after the tension of their previous conversations. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, unsure of how to navigate the situation. But Heather, desperate to keep him close, pulled him inside, her smile forced but determined. She told him that everything would be fine, that they just needed to talk. Chris agreed reluctantly, still unsure of what was happening. As they sat down, Heather's thoughts were racing. She was hyper-aware of every movement he made, every word he spoke. She noticed how his eyes darted around the room, how he seemed uncomfortable with the silence between them. She could feel his distance, and it drove her mad. She had to close the gap, to make him realize that he belonged with her, not with Lily. The tension between them grew thick, suffocating as Heather's mind spiraled further. In a moment of blind desperation, Heather reached out to touch Chris's arm. The contact was brief, but it felt like an electric shock. She could see the way his body tensed, his discomfort clear. Chris pulled away, his face contorting with confusion and fear. That was all it took for Heather to snap. She couldn't hold back anymore. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she would do if he rejected her completely. She couldn't let him go, not now, not after everything she had done to keep him close. Without thinking, Heather made her move. Her emotions overtook her, and in a fit of rage and longing, she did the unthinkable. She grabbed a nearby object, something sharp, and in a blur of panic and fury, she struck. Chris, caught off guard, didn't have time to react. The room became a blur of chaos as Heather's actions spiraled further out of control. She watched in disbelief as Chris crumpled to the ground, his life slipping away in an instant. By the time Lily returned home, everything had changed. The once warm and familiar house now felt cold and alien. The tragedy that had unfolded in that short, terrifying moment would haunt them all forever. The news of Chris's death spread quickly, and what had once seemed like a quiet, suburban neighborhood was now a place of whispers and confusion. The investigation began almost immediately, and Heather's actions were scrutinized by police and detectives. At first, she was calm, almost eerily composed, but as the days passed, the shock of what she had done started to set in. Heather couldn't seem to make sense of the events that had led up to the tragic moment. Her mind was clouded, and yet deep down, she knew exactly what had happened. She had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. Lily was devastated. She had never imagined that something so horrific could happen in her own home, let alone at the hands of her mother. The betrayal she felt was unbearable, and the loss of Chris left her feeling empty and numb. She had trusted Heather, believed that she was the one person who would always be there for her. But now, that trust was shattered, replaced by a gnawing sense of loss and confusion. How could her mother, the woman who had raised her, commit such a terrible act? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Heather's obsession had been building for months, perhaps even longer. Detectives uncovered a trail of increasingly strange behavior: Heather's attempts to drive a wedge between Lily and Chris, her unsolicited attention, and the subtle manipulations she used to draw him closer to her. They pieced together the signs of a woman spiraling into an obsession that clouded her judgment and ultimately led to the unthinkable. It was hard for anyone to comprehend that a mother could do this to her own daughter, let alone for the reasons that seemed to drive Heather's actions. The trial was a public spectacle, one that no one could have predicted. Heather, once a loving mother and respected member of the community, now faced charges of murder. Her defense claimed she had been suffering from a deep mental illness, that her obsession with Chris had overtaken her and distorted her perception of reality. Some in the courtroom sympathized with her, understanding that she had struggled with loneliness and emotional neglect, but the brutality of her actions was undeniable. As the trial progressed, it became evident that there were no simple answers, no easy explanations for what had transpired. For Lily, the aftermath of her mother's crime was a slow, painful journey. She would never be the same person again, and the scars left by her mother's betrayal would never fully heal. She struggled with grief, anger, and a sense of betrayal that haunted her every waking moment. The once warm, loving relationship she had shared with her mother was gone, replaced by a cold, unrecognizable figure who had shattered her world. In the end, Heather was convicted, but the tragedy of what had happened was something that no verdict could ever fully address. It was a story of obsession, of love twisted into something dark and dangerous. It left a family broken, a community shaken, and a young girl forever changed. The tragic outcome of Heather's obsession with Chris would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives.